So this is a different style of video to what I normally do, and I don't know what possessed me to make this video given that the script is over 3 dissertations long, but I reread Dracula for the 5th time and I have thoughts that I need to share, otherwise I will burst. So some introductory housekeeping for you. I'm going to be summarising the entire story of Dracula with illustrations I did myself. This is not a literary analysis, these are just my own opinions because I'm a big fan of this book and would highly recommend everyone reading it, but there are some bits in here that make me roll my eyes so hard I risk torpedoing them directly into my brain every time. Truly the most book of all time. But again, don't take it too seriously, I'm just interpreting this book from my own perspective and other people might interpret things differently. Also, this book is more for comedic purposes rather than literary analysis because I just want more people to experience the original story. If you're not already aware, Dracula is an epistolary narrative, meaning that the entire story is told in a series of journal entries, newspaper cuttings, letters, logbooks, etc. There is an in-universe explanation for this, but it means there's also a lot of different POVs and different characters will often repeat the same events but from different perspectives and in slightly random orders, so I've reshuffled a few things to make it flow better. Also, trigger warnings on screen. The book does touch on a lot of sensitive topics with Victorian era attitudes towards them because it was published in 1897, so if any of these would be distressing for you, please feel free to click away. If I missed any warnings, do just let me know and I'll put them in the comments. The book does also use some outdated language that are now considered slurs, especially in reference to travelling people, and I won't be repeating those, but I will be quoting the book a lot, so if I do accidentally repeat any other language that's offensive, again, please just let me know. Also, massive spoilers for the entire book and a little bit for Nosferatu 2024. So, let's start by introducing the key players. First, the man himself, Count Dracula, County von Dracula, Dracky D if you will. Then we have Jonathan Harker, Mina Murray, Dr. John or Jack Seward, who I would definitely fight, Lucy Westenra, Professor / Dr. Abraham Van Helsing, titles used interchangeably, does periodically say stuff that also makes me want to fight him, Arthur Holmwood, Quincy Morris, and lastly, Renfield. Now, since there are technically 2 Johns in this story, anytime I refer to John or Jonathan, I'm specifically referring to Jonathan Harker, and Dr. John will either be referred to as Jack or Seward. Probably just Seward, but if you randomly hear me talking about a Jack, it's that guy. Also, I'm literally so stupid, but despite me having read this book 5 times, I only realised that Lucy's surname was Westenra and not Westerner, so if you randomly hear me saying Westerner, that's why. There are other characters, but the ones I've shown are the most important, and I'll introduce everyone else as I go along. The way I've drawn these characters may not exactly match up with their book descriptions, but this is just how I imagine them, and there's a lot of Victorian men in this book, so I need to distinguish what they all look like. Now, let's begin at last. The story starts off with Jonathan Harker on his way to Transylvania to conduct some business for a Count Dracula. Jonathan is a solicitor working for a Mr. Hawkins in Exeter, who is also a bit like Jonathan's father figure, and Dracky has basically employed Mr. Hawkins to manage his affairs as he plans to move to London, but he needs someone to come in person to help him sort out the paperwork, so Mr. Hawkins sends our Johnny boy. So Jonathan is writing in his journal as he travels from England to Transylvania and makes a note of interesting things here and there, in particular things he plans to share with his fiancée Mina Murray, who is back in England. Side note, I really love the relationship between Mina and Jonathan because they're so clearly devoted to each other, and I think it's kind of sad how in a lot of adaptations of Dracula they throw away that relationship just to put Mina and Dracula together. So justice for my man Jonathan, no one is husbanding better than you, and that is the hill I will die on. Also, side note part 2, here is one of the many examples of Dracula literally being a comedy. Anyway, once Jonathan makes it to Transylvania, he stays at a hotel and has some odd encounters with the locals, particularly when they realise that he's going to the Count's castle. The inn lady begs him not to go or to delay his journey by another day, but he refuses because he received another letter from Dracula that morning saying he would have a coach waiting for John at the mountain pass. As the inn lady can't convince him, she gives him a rosary to wear instead. Jonathan gets ready to set off, but before he goes, he sees a small crowd of people by the inn just watching him with pity. They all cross themselves and say something, which kind of freaks him out, but he can't really understand the language, so he just feels unsettled. He tries to translate a few words and thinks they're saying hell, Satan, and either werewolf or vampire, which does nothing to improve his mood. In the carriage, he's with a few other passengers who all seem quite nervous, and when they get to the meeting spot by evening, the driver makes makes a big show of Drakkie's coach not being there, so they probably weren't actually expecting him and they should just go back and try a different day. Jonathan suspects the driver was rushing to get there extra early and is now trying to make him go away when Drakkie's coach pulls up, complete with a creepy coachman and everything. Mr. Creepy Coachman with the gleaming teeth and red eyes implies that he knows the other coach driver tried to trick him by coming early, and honestly, shout out to all the townspeople for trying to save Jonathan from his fate. But anyway, the coach driver and the passengers have no choice but to hand over Jonathan's luggage and say farewell. Jonathan notes how strong the creepy coachman seems to be, given that he can carry all his luggage in one hand, but is currently still kind of oblivious. Before he gets driven away, however, he sees the normal coachman and the remaining passengers all cross themselves and gets freaked out again. The journey to Drakkie's castle is not pleasant for Johnny Boy. He gets the impression that they're going around in circles and notices weird lights in the distance and hears wolves chasing them. At one point, Mr. Creepy Coachman stops and gets down, disappearing into the forest for a while, and Jonathan realises he's surrounded by wolves. He tries to shout to make them go away, but they don't listen to him. The creepy coachman suddenly returns and commands the wolves to leave, which they do. He then gets back on the coach and they drive off, finally making it to the Count's castle. Once they arrive, the creepy coachman puts all Jonathan's luggage down in front of the main door and drives off. Jonathan notices again how strong he seems to be, but is left standing there all alone in the dark. He waits for so long that he starts to think he might just have to wait outside all night when the door opens to reveal none other than Count Dracula. When Jonathan steps inside and shakes his hand, which is ice cold, he notes that the Count seems to have extraordinary strength, exactly like the coachman whom he hadn't seen. Suspicious. Drackie carries in all Jonathan's luggage by himself, saying his servants aren't available because it's so late, and sees him to his rooms. Jonathan finds supper already laid out for him and eats alone, as Dracula says he ate already. The two of them then sit by the fire and Jonathan is able to get a closer look at Dracula's appearance, noticing he has slightly pointy ears, very sharp teeth, and especially red lips. He isn't quite able to hide his discomfort, especially when Dracula comes closer and makes strange remarks about wolves, and they end up sitting together for a while until day breaks and Drackie sends him off to bed. The next day, Jonathan wakes up late and is left all alone. As he wanders around, he notices that there doesn't seem to be a single mirror in the house or any other people. He eventually finds a library full of all sorts of books about England, and Drackie later finds him there that evening. Dracula asks Jonathan to tell him all there is to know about life in London and about the property he recently purchased, which is a rundown estate called Carfax that has an old chapel attached to it and a private asylum next door. He also asks John to correct him on his English pronunciation because he doesn't want it to be obvious when he's there that he's a foreigner. Dracula tells Jonathan that he can go anywhere in the castle he likes except where the doors are locked, and they end up talking again until dawn. Jonathan gets sent to bed again, but he's only able to sleep for a few hours before getting up and decides to try and shave. He has a tiny little mirror as part of his shaving kit, so he ends up using that, but cuts himself when he gets startled by Dracula, who he didn't see coming up behind him. At first, he thinks it must have been a trick, but when he looks in the mirror again, he realises for sure that the Count is not appearing in the mirror, despite being directly behind Jonathan. When Dracula notices the cut on Jonathan's face, he seems to suddenly become enraged and tries to grab Jonathan's throat, but when his fingers touch Jonathan's rosary, he calms down and warns him about the dangers of cutting himself before claiming the mirror is a symbol of vanity and throwing it out the window. Dracula then sweeps off, leaving Jonathan all alone, and Jonathan notes the view, seeing that the castle is over a large cliff drop on three sides with a forest for miles around the rest. When he goes to explore the castle, he realises the entire place is full of locked doors, with the only way out being the windows, and that he is essentially a prisoner in the castle. Once Johnny Boy calms down from this revelation, he realises he needs to keep his fears to himself, and his eyes open as Dracula is obviously going to try and gaslight gatekeep Garlos him. He hears Drackie coming back and quietly sneaks up to his room, spying Dracula making his bed and laying the table, which confirms his fears that there are no other people in the castle. This also makes Jonathan realise that it must have been Dracula driving the coach on the first night, and that he can somehow control the wolves. He feels particularly grateful to the old inn lady for giving him the crucifix, even though he's a Protestant, and decides that he's going to try and gather more information from Dracula. For the next few days, Jonathan and Dracula fall into a routine where they talk in the evening and until dawn, but he's left mostly to his own devices during daylight hours. Jonathan learns specifically about the history of the Draculas, with Drackie talking almost like he was there, and he also gets questioned a lot by Dracula about how solicitors work in England and whether he can have multiple different ones in different places, implying that he doesn't want any one person to know his business. He also coerces Jonathan to write to Mr. Hawkins to tell him he's going to stay for another month, and Jonathan agrees, knowing he doesn't really have a choice. Dracula makes it clear that Jonathan should be careful what he writes, as the envelopes are so thin he can read what's written. So Jonathan writes to Mr. Hawkins and Mina for Dracula, but decides decides he's going to write secret letters to both of them using shorthand for Mina's letter because they often communicate that way. Dracula briefly leaves the room and Jonathan tries to spy on some of Dracula's own letters, spotting several names and addresses to different solicitors and bankers, but Dracula comes back, so Jonathan has to go back to what he was doing. Before leaving, Dracula also gives Jonathan a warning not to sleep in any other part of the castle except for his own rooms for his own safety. Jonathan tries to take a moment to breathe and decides, actually, I'll sleep where I like, as long as Dracula's not around, and he goes to the window to get some fresh air. He feels a brief moment of relief at first, even though it's still night, but then he sees Dracula slowly coming out of another window on the other side of the castle, and to his horror, start crawling face down the wall. Jonathan watches Dracula do the same thing on a different night, and decides that now is his chance to explore the castle more thoroughly since he knows Dracky isn't home, but he finds that the front door is locked. He ends up in the right wing of the castle after forcing his way through a rusted door and finds a lady's room with a little table that he uses to take the opportunity to update his diary. He ends up falling asleep on a couch, basically determined to disobey Dracula, but during the night he wakes up briefly and realises he isn't alone. Under his eyelashes he can see 3 young women in the room with him, 1 blonde and 2 dark-haired that have similar features to Dracula. Now, it's likely that the blonde one may be Dracula's wife and the other 2 his relatives, but since it's not made clear in the book, I will be referring to all 3 of them as Dracula's wives because it's easier that way and also pop culture. Anyway, Dracula's wives approach Jonathan and he notes they're all very beautiful with voluptuous lips, which gives him the sudden desire for them to kiss him. Now, this is one of the 2 moments in the book that I will be side-eyeing Jonathan, like, dude, you have a fiancé, but I will give him a pass here because he's kind of under their spell. He hears the wives whispering to each other that there will be kisses for them all and the blonde one should go first, and Jonathan feels her kneeling down beside him and putting her lips and teeth on his neck. Before anything can happen, however, the atmosphere of the room changes and Dracula arrives in a rage, throwing the wife back and warning them all that Jonathan belongs to him. Then there's a moment where Dracula stares at Jonathan's face and softly tells the wives that he too can love. Okay, Dracula, very suspicious. Anyway, he tells the wives they can kiss Jonathan as much as they want when he's done with him, then tosses them a sack with a child in it for dinner. The wives snatch up the sack and fade away without using the door, which causes Jonathan to faint in horror. The next morning, Jonathan wakes up back in his room and updates his diary about the whole thing. He now realises that his safety is entirely at the mercy of Dracula for as long as he's useful. He notes that his clothes aren't folded like he usually does them, and his watch is unwound, so he's not sure if what he experienced was entirely real or if it's all a sign that he's losing his mind. He is glad, however, that Dracula didn't find the diary, otherwise he would have definitely destroyed it. He goes back down to the same rooms, this time during the day, and checks but finds that the door is tightly locked and decides it definitely wasn't a dream and that he needs to do something quickly. Dracky comes to him the next day and tells him to write 3 letters to Mina and Mr. Hawkins. 1 to say that he's nearly finished with his work, 1 that he is just setting off, and 1 that said he had arrived at the next town, and Dracula makes him put future dates on them for up to a month in advance. Dracula uses the pretense that the post is unreliable, so it's better that all the letters are written and held at the next town to be sent off until the right time. But Jonathan knows it's so the alarm bells aren't raised immediately when he goes missing. He decides he can't openly disobey Dracula and make him suspicious, so his best chance is to just obey and quietly wait for an opportunity to escape. At this point, both of them know that Jonathan knows too much to be allowed to live. A group of travelling people soon come to the castle about a week later, and Jonathan seizes the opportunity to try and escape. He speaks to the travelling people through the window and tosses them the secret letters to Mina and Mr. Hawkins, along with some coins. He tries to indicate to them to post the letters, as he can't understand their language, and they seem to understand him, so he feels hopeful. Dracula later comes in with those 2 letters. He makes a show of telling Jonathan that, of course he'll post the letter to Mr. Hawkins. Jonathan just needs to reseal it because he accidentally opened it, you know? The other one, though, has weird symbols on it, and it's unsigned, so it obviously must not have anything to do with them, so he tosses them into the fire. Dracula then cheerfully advises John to go to bed, and as he leaves, quietly locks him in. The next day, Jonathan wakes up and finds all of his documents are gone, as well as anything that might have helped him outside the castle. Not only that, every scrap of paper in the room has been taken away, and his travelling suit and coat have been stolen. Jonathan is then left in this limbo with the Count for 2 weeks, but gets another brief glimpse of hope when another group of people come to the castle. He tries to meet them in the courtyard, but finds the door to his room is locked again from the outside. When he cries to them from the window, the leader of the group of travelling people from earlier comes out and tells them he's crazy, and everyone laughs at him. After that point, they all ignore him and get busy unloading a bunch of large boxes before leaving. He can later hear the travelling people working on something for Dracula and digging somewhere else in the castle. A week later, and a few days before the final date on the letters Dracula made him write, Jonathan sees Dracky crawling out of his window again. To his shock, he sees that Dracula is wearing his own clothes that had been stolen and is also carrying the bag that had held the kidnapped child in it. He realised Dracula plans to be seen in the next town wearing Jonathan's clothes so others can confirm that he's been spotted travelling and posting his own letters, as well as blame him for any evil doing that Draki does whilst he's there. Jonathan feels enraged at this and sits at the window to watch for Dracula's return when suddenly he notices some specks floating around outside the moonlight. They start to hypnotise him, but then he realises they're forming into the shapes of the three wives and he runs away again in terror back to his own room. When he later tries to open the doors again, he finds that they've locked by themselves, so he just sits there and cries for a long time. And honestly, poor Jonathan, like, what a terrible ordeal. Genuinely, I would have broken down. After a while, Jonathan hears the cries of a woman outside and gets up and goes to the window. When she spots him, she starts screaming at him, calling him a monster and telling him to give her back her child. Jonathan hears Draki's voice call down from high above and he summons a bunch of wolves who devour the woman, so RIP. Jonathan feels spurred into action the next day when he sees the sunrise and wonders, since he never actually sees Dracula during the day, whether he sleeps during this time. He hatches a plan to try and sneak into Draki's room by going out through the window the same way he's seen Dracula do, which is very brave. I know I definitely don't have the guts for something like that. He manages to make the climb down and slips into Draki's room without falling to his death, but to his surprise finds Dracula's room is almost entirely empty, with everything being covered in layers of dust. There's a pile of ancient gold coins in one corner, as well as a bunch of other old ornaments, but Jonathan isn't able to find any keys to the main door. He spots another heavy door across the room and finds that it's open, so goes through and down a flight of stairs and another passage until he finally ends up in an old ruined chapel. There's another door leading down to some vaults, but Jonathan searches every inch of the place first for a key. He finds that the earth from the chapel has been dug up and placed into the boxes he saw the men bringing earlier, and that there are 50 of them in total. To his shock, when he finally goes down into one of the vaults, he sees Dracula lying in one of the boxes with his eyes open, looking almost like a corpse. He gets frightened by the expression on the Count's face and runs back into his room, abandoning his search for the keys. The date of the last fake letter arrives, and Jonathan spots Draki leaving the castle in his clothes again to post it. When he gets back, he tells Jonathan that it's time to part ways and says his carriage will have to come tomorrow because his coachman and horses are busy tonight. Jonathan challenges this by demanding to leave now, saying he'll literally walk if he has to and he doesn't care about his luggage either. Dracula smiles at him and agrees, saying he won't keep him there another hour if that's what he wants. They go down to the main door, which, to Jonathan's surprise, is unlocked, and Dracula starts to open it. Outside, Dracula sees some howling wolves snapping at him and realises Dracula will happily let him get eaten by the wolves, so he relents and begs Dracula to close the door, defeatedly agreeing to wait until the morning. They go back to his room and Dracula leaves him there with a smile. Jonathan goes to his door where he can hear the Count's voice faintly and hears him telling the wives to be patient and that they can have him tomorrow night. Jonathan, in a rage, flings the door open and sees the wives licking their lips. Again, he is much braver than I would be in this situation. When they see him, they all laugh and the wives run away. Jonathan wakes up just before dawn the next day and runs down to try and get out the front door, but finds it's locked again in the morning. He decides he's going to get that front door key from Dracula, even if it kills him, and scales the wall again to get to the Count's room and back into the chapel. He finds Dracula asleep in one of the boxes again, but to his horror notes that he looks younger now and almost bloated, with fresh blood on his lips. Jonathan searches Dracula's body for a key but can't find it. He gets seized with the desire to end Dracula then and there and prevent him from feeding on people in London, so he grabs a shovel and tries to brain him, but Dracula's head turns and gives him a grin so terrifying that the shovel just bounces off Draki's forehead, leaving a gash. Jonathan then hears the sound of the travelling people coming back and rushes back to hide in the Count's room. He hears them hammering down and packing up the boxes to take away, and then they leave, and he's once again trapped. Jonathan knows that he's now alone in the castle with the wives and decides there is absolutely no way he's going to let them get to him, so he takes some of Dracula's gold coins and decides he's going to continue to scale the wall down as far as he can go or die trying. He updates his journal with his plans, saying his goodbyes to the people he loves, especially Mina, and takes the plunge.